Welcome to the research desk. I want you to imagine knowing exactly how many people shopped at a specific retail chain this quarter.
Down to the single digit, really.
Exactly, down to the single digit. And knowing it, 3 weeks before the chief executive officer even announces the official earnings.
Which sounds impossible, but
But in the spring of 2020, a select group of quantitative hedge funds did exactly that. They used optical satellites positioned in low Earth orbit. They essentially possessed empirical proof of a macroeconomic reality, while the rest of the market was just completely blind.
right. And today we are addressing a structural question regarding the fundamental nature of modern financial markets. The core debate is this: can alternative data and sentiment analysis provide a durable investment edge, or does this edge decay too rapidly to monetize due to, technological crowding?
Yeah, and our analysis today is rooted deeply in contemporary financial literature. We are drawing on recent studies published in the Financial Analyst Journal. We'll meticulously cover alternative data, sentiment momentum, and the continually shifting nature of alpha. So, I will argue that alternative data, through structural advantages and advanced integration, represents the definitive future of alpha generation.
And I will argue that the edge provided by alternative data decays far faster than investors can monetize it. It basically creates an illusion of alpha that quickly collapses into crowded herding.
Well, to truly understand the magnitude of this shift toward alternative data, we have to establish what it is replacing, or, at least supplementing.
Right, the traditional baseline.
Yeah, for decades, the entire quantitative finance industry relied on the foundational models of asset pricing, specifically the Fama-French factor models. We looked at market risk, size, value, profitability, and investment patterns. But we really need to define how those traditional models actually function to see their limitations.
I think the easiest way to visualize the traditional Fama-French approach is to think about predicting the top speed of a vehicle.
Oh, that's a good way to frame it.
Yeah. So if you want to know how fast a car can go, you can look at its static characteristics. You measure the weight of the chassis, the size of the engine, the aerodynamic profile.
Right.
In financial terms, that is exactly what traditional factors do. You look at the book-to-market ratio to determine value, or the market capitalization to determine size. You are measuring the structural characteristics of the equity.
Precisely. You are measuring the static engine size. The problem is that the return-generating process in modern markets is vastly richer and, frankly, infinitely more complex than those static characteristics can capture. A value factor relies on a company's quarterly book value.
Which is a lagging indicator.
Exactly. It is a backward-looking metric. It is a photograph of the engine taken 3 months ago. The literature now robustly documents that short-term signals existing far beyond the traditional Fama-French boundaries contain actionable, statistically significant information.
So you're saying the alternative data is more dynamic.
Right. We are currently witnessing an explosion of alternative data because alternative data does not look at the size of the engine. It looks at the revolutions per minute of the engine in real time. We have satellite imagery measuring shadows in industrial zones, credit card transaction flows, monitoring consumer health by the hour.
Web traffic analytics.
Yes, web traffic and sophisticated natural language processing models parsing corporate communications. This data captures real, ground truth economic activity weeks or even months before traditional financial statements are compiled, audited, and released to the public. Possessing this empirical reality before the broader market recognizes it provides an undeniable structural advantage.
Well, I readily acknowledge that alternative data contains real empirical information. Satellite imagery of a shipping port or aggregated credit card flows certainly reflect ground truth economic activity. I am not disputing the validity of the data itself.
Okay,
But information content does not equal durable alpha. That is the fundamental disconnect in the modern quantitative narrative. Once a novel dataset is discovered and proves to be predictive, it is immediately packaged, marketed, and sold by data vendors.
You're talking about commoditization.
Exactly. The information becomes widely available and its predictive value is aggressively priced into the market within months, if not weeks. The core thesis we must confront is the rapid rate of alpha decay. We are observing a 12 to 18-month half-life for the alpha generated by alternative data.
12 to 18 months is still a window of opportunity, though.
Sure, but when you calculate the exorbitant costs of data acquisition, the vast infrastructure required to clean and process unstructured data, and the inevitable trading losses generated by false positives, the costs vastly outstrip the fleeting returns. You are purchasing a highly depreciating asset.
I want to challenge that assertion by moving from the theoretical mechanics of data decay directly to the empirical evidence. If we want to test the durability of these signals, we need to look at how sentiment acts as a priced factor over time. Let us examine George Serafeim's 2020 paper in the Financial Analyst Journal.
Ah, yes.
This is a seminal piece with 272 citations, and it structurally altered how we view intangible metrics. Serafeim demonstrated that changes in environmental, social, and governance sentiment predict stock returns. But the methodology is what matters here. He did not simply look at an absolute ESG score provided by a rating agency. He isolated the momentum of public perception.
We should clarify how that momentum is actually isolated, though, because it speaks directly to the complexity of these models. Serafeim was not just surveying investors.
No, not at all.
This requires massive natural language processing pipelines. You have to scrape millions of news articles, press releases, and regulatory filings. The algorithm must assign a numerical weight to the language surrounding a specific company based on its environmental or social impact.
Exactly. The model parses the text and assigns a positive or negative valence. But the breakthrough in Serafeim's work was proving that the absolute score, whether the company is currently viewed as good or bad, is largely irrelevant to generating excess returns. The alpha is entirely captured in the velocity and direction of the sentiment.
The momentum.
Right. If a historically poorly perceived mining company begins executing a transition to sustainable practices, the text in the media shifts. The model captures the mathematical acceleration of that positive language. Serafeim proved that this acceleration structurally leads the market pricing.
And he's not the only one to find this.
No, this is not an isolated phenomenon. Edelin, Marcus, and Terhanians established in their 2010 FAJ work that relative sentiment has definitive pricing implications. Furthermore, Blitz and his co-authors in 2023 provided conclusive evidence that these short-term sentiment signals survive rigorous standard factor adjustments.
Meaning they hold up against Fama-French?
Yes, they ran the sentiment data through the Fama-French 5-factor model, and the excess returns did not disappear. So the sentiment data is not merely a proxy for known risks. It is a distinct, durable driver of return.
Look, the mathematical rigor of Serafeim's work is absolutely not in question. He correctly identified a historical inefficiency. But the application of that sentiment extraction as a durable, forward-looking strategy is highly problematic. Sentiment is incredibly noisy.
How so?
It is vulnerable to exogenous shocks, media manipulation, and algorithmic feedback loops. I look at this through the lens of evolutionary biology. Consider the history of the antibiotic.
Okay.
When medical science first discovers an antibiotic, it is miraculously effective. It completely eradicates the bacterial infection because the bacteria have absolutely no defense mechanism against this novel compound. It saves countless lives.
Right. The initial alpha.
Precisely. However, the very application of the antibiotic forces the biological environment to adapt. The bacteria that survive mutate. Resistance builds. Within a few short generations, the miracle drug loses its efficacy entirely, and you require a stronger, vastly more complex compound just to achieve the baseline result.
Well, let me stop you right there to interrogate that analogy. When you say the market builds resistance to the sentiment signal, what is the actual mechanism? Are you arguing that the market actively builds antibodies to trick the data, or simply that the data gets too expensive to buy? Because those are two entirely different mechanisms of decay.
It is the former. The market actively immunizes itself through capital flows. Sentiment signals operate on the exact same biological principle as the antibiotic. They are incredibly powerful upon initial discovery. But the moment a quantitative fund publishes a methodology for harvesting ESG sentiment momentum, or the moment that signal is proven in a backtest, capital floods into that specific mispricing.
The arbitrage closes the gap.
Yes. Proprietary trading desks build algorithms to front-run the momentum. The market becomes resistant because the information is instantly priced in. Furthermore, the bacteria, in this case the corporate entities, actively mutate to defeat the signal.
You mean corporate greenwashing?
Exactly. A positive sentiment score derived from natural language processing might simply reflect a sophisticated public relations campaign explicitly designed to use the keywords the algorithms are scanning for. This masks fundamental deterioration. The false positives generated by corporate spoofing destroy the alpha harvested from the true positives.
I see the logic in the antibiotic analogy, but the adaptation of the market does not invalidate the underlying signal. It simply requires the practitioner to refine their extraction methodology. I mean, if corporate public relations teams start using algorithmic keywords, you update the natural language processing model to detect syntactic anomalies that indicate PR framing versus organic news reporting.
Which is incredibly expensive.
It is, but it's part of the evolution. But let us pivot from the extraction of linguistic sentiment to the tracking of physical reality. You argue that sentiment is too noisy and easily manipulated. What happens when the data is immediate, physical, and fundamentally impossible for a corporate entity to manipulate?
You're talking about the parking lots.
Yes. The digitization of the physical world provides the clearest test case for the durability of an informational edge. We must examine the widely documented case study of satellite imagery monitoring retail parking lots, specifically Walmart.
Right. This is perhaps the most famous narrative in alternative data.
And for good reason. Let us detail exactly how this works mechanically. In spring of 2020, amid severe global lockdowns, early adopters of alternative data procured high-resolution optical satellite imagery to track daily vehicle density in Walmart parking lots.
And they weren't just looking at the photos manually.
No, they utilized machine learning algorithms trained to measure the pixel density of the shadows cast by the vehicles. By measuring the angle of the sun and the length of the shadow, the algorithm could differentiate between a compact car and a large truck, which correlates strongly to consumer basket size.
It's a brilliant pipeline, I'll admit.
It is. Through this highly advanced physical pipeline, these quantitative funds observed retail demand recovering weeks before the official quarterly sales data was released. They possessed empirical, mathematical proof of a macroeconomic recovery while traditional analysts were still relying on outdated, pessimistic forecasts. They positioned their portfolios early and profited immensely. This was pure, structural alpha derived from observing physical reality faster than the traditional reporting apparatus could function.
I understand the mechanics of the shadow measurement, but I completely reject this as a model for the future of quantitative outperformance.
Why? It worked perfectly.
The Walmart satellite narrative is actually the ultimate indictment of the alternative data industry. You accurately described the initial discovery in 2020. Now examine the environment in 2023.
Okay.
Parking lots to hundreds of quantitative funds. The raw information was entirely commoditized, the alpha completely compressed.
Well,
When hundreds of competing algorithms are trained on the identical pixel density of a retail parking lot, and they all simultaneously execute trades based on that identical shadow measurement, the mispricing is eliminated in a fraction of a millisecond. There is absolutely no structural advantage remaining.
It becomes a crowded trade.
Exactly. This perfectly illustrates the 12 to 18-month half-life I referenced earlier. The early adopters captured a fleeting inefficiency in 2020, but the subsequent capital spent by latecomers on those satellite subscriptions in 2023 yielded absolutely zero excess return. It is the textbook definition of quantitative crowding. The edge vanished.
I concede the compression of the raw signal. It is undeniable that the half-life of exclusive access has shrunk. But I completely reject the conclusion that the data therefore becomes useless or that the edge vanishes entirely.
You are treating alternative data as a standalone proprietary secret.
Because that's what generates the excess return.
But you are assuming the data only has value if you are the only person holding it. In modern markets, alternative data is foundational infrastructure. Consider the invention of radar in military aviation.
Okay, the radar analogy.
When radar was first deployed, it provided a devastatingly powerful asymmetric advantage. You could see the adversary through the clouds, and they were completely blind. It was a proprietary secret. Today, every commercial and military aircraft on Earth possesses radar.
It provides zero asymmetric advantage because everyone is looking at the identical screen, which proves my point perfectly. The alpha of the radar compressed to zero.
But that is exactly where your framework breaks down. You cannot simply remove the radar from your aircraft just because the asymmetric advantage compressed. You absolutely must have the radar just to survive in the airspace. If you turn it off, you crash.
So it's just a cost of doing business now?
Yes, alternative data operates identically. The baseline of market participation has permanently shifted. The alpha no longer comes from merely possessing the satellite feed. The alpha is generated by how your quantitative architecture integrates that radar data.
Integration over access.
Precisely. If everyone has the satellite feed showing the Walmart parking lot is full, the fund that generates alpha is the one that cross-references that identical satellite feed with proprietary credit card panel data, regional supply chain logistics, and real-time inflation metrics to determine if the full parking lot actually translates to higher profit margins or just higher foot traffic buying low-margin essential goods. The edge has not vanished, it has moved. The edge is in the complex integration matrix, not the raw feed itself.
Right, but that integration matrix requires an astonishing amount of capital. We need to consider the economic implications of your radar analogy. You are arguing for a permanent structural increase in the operating costs of asset management simply to tread water.
It is an arms race, certainly.
If every fund must purchase expensive decaying satellite feeds just to avoid being adversely selected by the market, the only entities generating durable profit are the data vendors selling the subscriptions. The funds are running incredibly expensive infrastructure just to achieve the market average. But let us examine how this dynamic of crowding and integration plays out when we move away from tracking physical objects like cars and return to the textual and emotional data generated by market participants. I am referring to the concept of emotion beta.
Emotion beta represents a fascinating and highly lucrative evolution in alternative factor construction. We are moving beyond tracking physical objects to tracking the psychology of the market itself. Hassan, Kumar, and Tafler, in their forthcoming 2025 Financial Analyst Journal paper, rigorously document emotion beta as a newly priced risk factor.
Right.
To understand this, we have to contrast it with the traditional Fama-French models we discussed earlier. Traditional models inherently assume that human beings are rational actors attempting to maximize utility. Emotion beta mathematically acknowledges that markets are driven by human irrationality. It measures the aggregate emotional state of market participants, fear, exuberance, panic, and converts that psychological state into a tradable numerical factor.
But how exactly is this psychological state quantified? Because without a rigorous mechanism, it sounds indistinguishable from the noisy sentiment scores we discussed with Serafeim's work.
It is vastly more precise. It seamlessly connects to the findings of Breyer and Ketch, who published in the FAJ in 2025. They proved that retail-driven articles published on platforms like Seeking Alpha possess actual statistically significant predictive value.
By just scanning for bullish or bearish words?
No. Natural language processing pipelines do not just count the frequency of the word bullish or bearish. They map the syntactic structure of the retail text. If retail investors on Seeking Alpha begin using language structures that indicate high cognitive load and panic, sentences become shorter, certainty modifiers decrease, risk-averse vocabulary spikes, the NLP model captures that shift.
I see.
Emotion beta turns that human panic into a specific risk premium. This is not simply about acquiring data faster than a competitor. It is about utilizing entirely different categories of data. Harvesting emotion beta allows quantitative models to internalize human behavioral biases that traditional fundamental factor models completely ignore. It provides the mathematical framework to profit from structural human irrationality.
Harvesting text from retail message boards and defining it as a novel risk factor is simply the latest iteration of behavioral crowding. We have seen this exact cycle repeatedly over the last decade. First, quantitative funds scraped Twitter sentiment. When that alpha decayed, they moved to Reddit sentiment. Now, the academic literature is focusing on Seeking Alpha articles.
It's an evolution.
In the alternative data space, there is an inescapable rule. The first prospectors find gold, the last prospectors find a gift shop.
That's quite an analogy.
But it's true. By the time a rigorous academic paper is published in the Financial Analyst Journal in 2025, proving that seeking alpha articles have predictive value, you have to realize that the gold has already been mined out of the river. The inefficiency was discovered years prior by highly secretive proprietary trading firms. It was aggressively arbitraged, and the mispricing was permanently closed.
So you are suggesting that the published literature is essentially a lagging indicator of where the alpha used to be.
Absolutely. Now, the data vendors are simply setting up gift shops on the riverbank. They are selling expensive application programming interface subscriptions to latecomers who are desperately chasing historical backtests. And the environment has fundamentally degraded. You are attempting to harvest emotion from platforms that have already been entirely overrun by automated bots.
Well, bot filtering is standard practice now.
But we have adversarial algorithms deliberately designed to spoof the exact sentiment analysis models you are deploying. A hedge fund can deploy a swarm of bots to write negative retail articles using the exact syntax of panic your model is trained to detect, triggering your emotion beta factor to sell while the opposing fund quietly accumulates the position. You are not harvesting human irrationality, you are harvesting artificial noise generated by competing algorithms.
I must push back on that because it drastically underestimates the technological leap we have made in processing textual data. You are evaluating modern linguistic analysis through the lens of early rudimentary word-counting algorithms and basic semantic mapping.
How is it functionally different today?
The defense against adversarial spoofing is superior cognitive architecture. This brings us directly to the deployment of large language models processing corporate communications. We have entered an era where artificial intelligence agents are reading corporate earnings call transcripts at a scale and depth that is fundamentally unprecedented in financial history. We are no longer relying on basic NLP to gauge retail panic. We are using massive neural networks to interrogate the highest levels of corporate leadership.
Explain the mechanical difference for me. How does a large language model extract an edge from an earnings call that a human analyst or a traditional NLP script misses? Because every human analyst on Wall Street listens to those exact same calls.
The difference is the scale of the cross-sectional analysis and the mapping of linguistic vector space. A human analyst listens to a chief financial officer answer a question about supply chain delays. The human makes a subjective judgment about whether the executive sounded confident.
Right.
A large language model maps the linguistic distance between the analyst's specific question and the executive's specific answer. If the analyst asks for a quantitative timeline on inventory resolution and the executive responds with qualitative platitudes about the resilience of the team, the large language model mathematically quantifies the evasiveness of the answer based on the semantic distance in the vector space.
That is fascinating.
Furthermore, the model compares that specific level of evasiveness to every single answer that executive has given over the past 40 quarters. It detects micro changes in management confidence that are invisible to the human ear. And it performs this analysis across 5,000 global equities simultaneously in real time the second the transcript hits the wire. Human analysts simply cannot process nuance at a vast cross-sectional scale. Large language models represent the ultimate tool for scaling alternative data. They provide a highly durable edge through superior cognitive processing capability, entirely superseding the need for exclusive access to proprietary datasets.
You are assuming that this superior processing capability operates in a vacuum. It absolutely does not. The critical flaw in this architecture is the consolidation of the underlying intelligence. If every major institutional fund deploys a large language model to parse earnings calls, you have to ask what model they are actually using.
Well, there are several foundation models.
Yes, but they are not building these massive neural networks from scratch. They are all utilizing the exact same underlying foundation models, because there are only a handful of technologically viable, multi-billion parameter foundation models in existence. If 50 massive quantitative funds use the exact same foundation model to measure the linguistic vector space of an earnings call, you are generating highly correlated, perfectly overlapping signals.
But each fund fine-tunes the model differently. They assign different risk weights to the evasiveness score.
The fine-tuning is marginal compared to the baseline interpretation of the foundational model.
If the core model concludes simultaneously for all 50 funds that a chief financial officer was evasive regarding supply chain headwinds, and every single algorithmic trading desk executes a short position based on that identical linguistic assessment at the exact same millisecond, you do not create durable alpha.
You're saying it's a structural risk.
You create rapid, systemic, algorithmic herding. You are engineering flash crowding events. In quantitative finance, the correlation of risk models is the highest predictor of systemic market fragility. When everyone uses the identical natural language pipeline to read the identical earnings transcript, the mispricing is compressed instantly. But the danger is not just that the alpha decays.
What's the larger danger then?
The danger is that the correlated positioning creates catastrophic market unwinds when the underlying foundation model hallucinates. What happens when the AI misinterprets a sector-wide linguistic nuance and 50 massive funds execute the wrong trade simultaneously? You have built a massively expensive engine for systemic risk.
The risk of correlation is precisely why raw data access, even the raw output of an LLM, is no longer the final objective. Throughout our deep dive today, we have examined the entire trajectory of alternative data. We started with Serafeim's validation of sentiment momentum as a structural factor, proving that perception leads price.
Right.
We explored the transition from early satellite imagery monopolies to the ubiquitous physical tracking of retail footprints. We examined the formalization of human behavioral biases into emotion beta. And finally, the application of massive neural networks to quantify executive linguistics. My position remains that alternative data, in all these diverse forms, represents a real, vital source of market truth. It captures the real-time revolutions per minute of the economy, illuminating dimensions that traditional, backward-looking accounting statements fundamentally obscure.
But the extraction requires...
However, the requirement for extracting outperformance hasn't evolved. Alternative data must be treated as a highly potent supplement to fundamental analysis, not a standalone automated strategy. The durable alpha exists entirely in the proprietary architecture, how uniquely a fund combines the satellite data, the LLM evasiveness score, and the Fama-French value factor.
And my position remains that the physical and economic realities of data diffusion prevent alternative data from being a durable long-term edge. The half-life of novel information is perpetually shrinking. The moment a signal is validated in the literature, whether it is an ESG sentiment score, the shadow of a car in a parking lot, or an automated interpretation of a chief financial officer's tone, the capital markets aggressively immunize themselves against it through rapid arbitrage.
The resistance builds, as you said.
Yes. The easy money of simply purchasing a unique alternative data set and riding the inefficiency is definitively over. The burden has entirely shifted. Funds now face the immense cost of continuous data renewal, the constant requirement to manage the decay of historical signals, and the incredibly complex integration required simply to maintain parity with the broader market and avoid adverse selection. The costs are permanent, while the alpha is fleeting.
Well, while we disagree the ultimate durability of the yield and the systemic risks involved, our analysis points toward a singular, undeniable synthesis. As the contemporary literature clearly establishes, the landscape of quantitative finance has fundamentally transformed. The aha moment we must take away from all these papers is this: the edge has moved from having better data to having better questions about the same data everyone else has. The future of quantitative outperformance is not reliant on acquiring more obscure datasets. It is entirely dependent on superior architecture, advanced integration, and human ingenuity directing the models.
I can agree with that conclusion. The raw materials are commoditized. The gold has been mined. The value is now exclusively in the engineering of the refinery.
This is the research desk officially signing off.